Okay, so today we're going to talk about Scottish dads and lessons that we could learn from Sweden and across the world. So, and just what's happening as well globally with dads, because I think that we can see, certainly our dad survey provides quite a lot of information about what's happening here, but it's useful sometimes just get a sense of the context in which it's happening. So is it the same in America? Is it the same in the EU? Is it the same, in other parts of the world? So hopefully today you'll get a kind of sense of that. So it's been 50 years since Sweden brought in state-funded parental leave, and hopefully we'll find out what they've learned in that time. So to provide you with a bit of context, Sweden in the 1970s, so the women's right movement was happening globally at that time. So in the 1960s and the 1970s, and in the US, Gloria Steineman, who was a really preeminent voice in women's issues, predicted that women are not going to be equal outside of the home until men are equal in it. So this kind of notion or this change in attitude towards women being predominantly caregivers and kind of excluded from the workplace in the 1960s, that sort of post-war transition, really took hold in Sweden. And they were really one of the first countries to act on what women were saying around the globe and take steps to boost gender equality and strengthen the welfare state to help women back into the workplace if they liked, or at that big transition in their lives. So in 1974, Sweden funded parental leave designed for couples to share, importantly. So it was 4 weeks of leave at 90% of salary paid for by the state. So it was really radical at the time. And importantly, so this is a researcher from the Swedish Institute of Social Research was saying that one of the stated goals of that piece of policy was to get fathers more involved in care work in the home, and at the same time make it possible for mothers to go to work and rejoin the workforce sooner. So it was really the policy wasn't just to support mothers in that transition, but it was really that notion of helping mothers back into the workplace if that's what they wanted to do. So as you can see, in 1974, Sweden funded parental leave designed for couples to share. It was 4 weeks of leave, 90% of salary, but there was only 0.5% of dads of leave days taken by dads at that stage. So it was very little uptake from dads at that point in 1974. So you could see the kind of cultural backlash, and obviously mothers just wanted to take the leave in order to recover from the birth and so on and so forth. So by 1975, they'd realized actually that what they needed to do was to provide dads with their own specific paternity leave. So in 1995, they introduced 30 days of use it or lose it leave specifically for dads. So it wasn't that that mothers and fathers had a total number of days that they could share, and they could work out whether the mum would take them or the dad would take them. They basically they realized that mum would by and large always want to take all the leave, and the dad wouldn't want to take that leave away from mum. And so they came up with this idea of kind of ring fence days for dads specifically to take. And it was very well received and had the desired effect. So in 2002 it increased to 60 days, and in 2016 it increased to 90 days. So today's parents in Sweden, including LGBTQ+, adoptive and single parents, are entitled to a total of 480 days. And now sort of 50 years on, 30% of leave is taken by dads. And this is the most generous state-funded package on the planet. So they're kind of really leading the way. So this is taken from a BBC article that was reflecting on some of the changes that have happened societally as a result of that 50 years of having these quite progressive policies in place. And again, this social researcher said that there's now a bit of a stigma on men who don't take leave. So it's kind of ingrained that being a good father, a modern father, is to take at least some leave. And in the workplaces, this has had quite a profound effect, actually. So there isn't a culture of working late in Sweden. I mean, these are all generalities, of course, but generally, there isn't a culture of working late. It's a norm for parents to not to pay for private childcare. So they're seeing to their childcare needs within the family. Parents tend to share childcare responsibilities, such as taking their kids from school back and forwards to school or looking after sick children. So it's not just the responsibility of the mum. Companies try to avoid early and late meetings in order to make it easier for parents to do pick up and drop off of their children. And really importantly, I think probably from just a societal perspective, parental leave policies have become an increasingly popular tool for businesses seeking to attract global talent. So, you know, sort of uh, white collar workers who are looking for really generous paternity leave are coming to Sweden. So they're attracting great people into their country. So this extended parental leave has real benefits for mental health as well. So mothers and fathers in countries which have generous leave schemes, including Sweden, see a reduced risk of depression and burnout. So obviously, if they have more time to bond as a family, that there's less pressure to both provide and care for their children. It's kind of, I suppose, it's obvious really you're going to have that reduced risk. And separate research of Swedish fathers showed the connection between those who took parental leave and a drop in risky behaviors around alcohol abuse. So in general as well, there's the general societal impact. So again, this is another professor in public health suggests that the generous parental leave policies have had a major impact across the population at large. So that injection of state support during those early years of a child's life really help. So they're saying that healthy parents mean healthy societies and healthy workers. She says supporting the idea that Sweden's family policies represent an investment far beyond the welfare handout. So, actually, she's saying that investing in the early years, right at the start, pays real dividends throughout the life of the child and the family and society at large. But what was interesting actually is, so you're talking about 50 years on from the start of this experiment, really social experiment. What they're showing is that there may well be limitations on gender equality. So 30% of all the days available to take parental leave, so that's mums and dads, 30% of them are taken by fathers, which means that the majority are still taken by mothers, which is kind of interesting actually. So is it really possible to reach 50-50? So is it really possible to reach gender parity between the sexes? And that's a question perhaps we'll answer in the future, or perhaps that's that's where we're going to stop at 30%. It's quite interesting, actually. So I'm just going to provide you with a little bit of information on a global perspective. So this is taken from a study. I can't quite remember how many countries there were involved in this. I think it was around about 20. Can't quite remember. Connor, can you remember?
No, I can't remember either.
I can find out that in due course. But it was looking at how different countries are support parents and also whether there are any changes. So this is, I think, a report from last year. and we can put that in the chat as well so you can have a little look at it. But fathers are doing more care work than they ever have done in the past, or certainly in the recent past, with mothers still doing more than fathers. But this is a graph that was provided as part of that report, just showing that mothers are pretty much doing more work across all of those sort of soft caring roles. So physical care for children, emotional care for children, overall care for partners, cleaning the house, preparing the food. Mothers are still doing more. But I think, as you can see, fathers are kind of catching up, which is really good news, actually. And it's certainly something that we're seeing is fathers increasingly doing more household chores, more cooking for their children, and obviously looking after their children as well. So again, just to give you a sense of where we sit with parental leave, the number of countries that give any paid leave for mothers is 160 countries across the globe. And the number of countries that give any paid leave to fathers is 122. Number of countries that allow 14 weeks or more, allow 14 more weeks or more rather than give. So there's an important distinction there. So allow 14 weeks or more of paid paternal leave for mothers is 120, and the number of countries that allow 14 weeks or more paid parental leave for fathers is 45, so a lot less there. And the number of countries that have paternity leave that is paid for 100% of previous earnings is 81. So just to give you a kind of sense of where the UK sits in terms of paid parental leave. So this is parental leave, which can be shared between the mother and the father. So it's not, we'll come on to paternal leave in a second. So this is taken from data from 2016. So things may have changed a little bit since then. But you can see that Poland is leading the field. There's a lot of EU countries, and we're sadly kind of quite near the bottom. So we're not quite as bad as the United States, Switzerland, or Mexico, but we're not doing terribly well, to be honest. And certainly the parental leave that we provide, the uptake from fathers is really very poor, actually, because obviously usually that means that the mother misses out. And sadly, the same can be said for paid father-specific leave. Japan and Korea, there's been quite a lot of news recently about Japan increasing the amount of paternity leave available because they have a crisis with the number of children being born in Japan. But you can see Japan and Korea are really incentivizing dads to take time off work. Again, we are sort of around the middle, maybe towards the bottom here, of paid father specific leave. And, you know, we're a very wealthy nation, so perhaps we should be further towards the Japan and Korea end. So just to give you a sense of what dads are entitled to, so in terms of statutory paternity leave, so this isn't obviously dealing with organizations who'll incentivize parental leave. So for example, there's lots of banks now that are providing really good paternity leave policies for their staff to, again, entice good members of staff in. So the statutory paternity leave at the moment is 2 weeks at just £172 per week. So this is regulated by Westminster. So it's not within the powers of the Scottish Government to make any changes to this, which is unfortunate, actually. So it's also worth noting that a fifth of fathers aren't eligible for paternity leave in this country because they haven't worked for their employer for long enough, or they're not employees, or they're self-employed. So they're barred from this statutory paternity leave. A recent survey by the Fatherhood Institute has shown that many can't afford to take the leave because the rate of pay is so low. you'll see below that actually it's a tiny proportion really of a dad's earning in those 2 weeks. So they're set to lose a lot of money if they take that leave. And mothers whose partners can't afford to take the leave, who don't have family nearby, may be left to recover from birth and establish breastfeeding support, breastfeeding without support. So they have limited access to health services. So it's probably a bit woefully inadequate. Fatherhood Institute and Pregnant and Screwed have been lobbying the Westminster government very hard on this recently. And to no avail, unfortunately. So the UK government has come back and said that they're doing very little to make any changes on that front. So I'm just going to go on to talk a little bit about what we found out about in our dad survey. So I'm not going to concentrate on most of the findings, the key findings from the dad survey. I'm going to concentrate on what dads told us they wanted to change, what one thing would make the biggest difference to them. So first of all, just to provide you with a bit of context. So most of you all know, I'm sure, that the COVID pandemic has had an absolutely enormous impact on fathering and dad's relationship with their children and their desire to take on more childcare responsibilities and their ability to do so, because as we're all sitting around on Zoom, this has become much easier to work from home. There's much more flexible working that's come about really as a result of the pandemic and everyone being shifted home for long periods of time. So the Fatherhood Institute did a really big survey back in the spring of 2020. And one of the things that they found was during the spring 2020 lockdown, fathers in coupled households stepped up to do much more hands-on caring of their children and more housework. So on average, the father almost doubled the number of hours each day he was undertaking childcare. So that's according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies. So father's childcare rose from just over 4 to 8 hours per day, whilst mothers rose from almost 7 to just over 10. So again, mums are doing a bit more, but dads are really catching them up. But it's worth saying that this is during the first lockdown. So this is when mums and dads or families together were in the household together. So it's kind of captured at that snapshot at that point in time. So we have been doing our dad surveys throughout really from the start of the COVID pandemic up until now. So we've tried to ask the same questions over and over again to see how dads' relationship with their children are changing, how they're doing, how their mental health is suffering or not as a consequence of what's happened over the last few years, and also the relationships that they have with their partners and their children. And their work-life balances. So just to kind of give you a sense of, this is kind of an ongoing process for us to try and see whether things are changing, what are changing, what's the landscape changing over time, or how is the landscape changing over time. So as I said, we asked dads, it was the last thing that we asked in our dad survey. Actually, this is the final question we asked, was what one thing would improve the lives of dads in Scotland? And I did the analysis on this, and it looked like there were 3 really overarching themes that came back from asking that question. So 41% of dads said that they wanted more support to balance providing for their children, so that sort of financial imperative of keeping the roof over the head, and actually being there for their children. 24% called for better support, particularly in service provision, so whether that's healthcare or education, or more support directly for dads. And finally, 20% of dads called for greater equality and acknowledgement of their role as a caregiver. And I think that's really interesting, actually, because I would have said that probably before the pandemic, that number would have been a lot lower. And I think that COVID and the effect of COVID has had a huge change in the way that dads are seeing or prioritizing their role as caregiver and providing childcare. But I think that structurally we're not keeping up with that change, and so dads feel a little bit left out. Anyway, so this 41% who wanted more support, balancing providing for their children and supporting their children. Many of them talked about they wanted time to devote to their family and support from their employers to meet their childcare responsibilities. So, as this dad said, I often feel my employers believe any issue with my children should be dealt with by the mum, pickups from school, attending events like school sports day, but my wife and I want to equal responsibility. So it's showing that shift again, I think. And as you can see, well, this is really interesting. So we asked dads if they feel their employer support their childcare obligations, and they had 4 options. So almost all the time, often, sometimes, and almost never. And what's interesting is that there's almost this almost completely mirror image of 25% of the dads feeling that their employer supports them almost all the time, and then 25% saying their employer almost never supports them. So there's an absolute split there. But this dad said the company I work for doesn't care about my life outside of work. They make you feel bad if you don't work your days off. And another dad saying my employer doesn't see the boundaries between work and home now, and I'm often doing 11 or 12 hours work and getting paid for 7.5. So I think that was a dad who's working from home, actually. Dads also wanted more financial support, particularly in response to the cost of living crisis. So dads talked about the various different ways in which governments could support them financially. So whether that was tax cuts or 4-day working weeks, there was a lot of kind of suggestion of how that could be done. But one of the very prominent themes or loudest themes to come out of it was paternity leave. So improved paternity leave right at the point where you're going through that major shift into fatherhood. So as this dad said, better paternity leave. I got 1 week, assuming no dad wants time to be with their child in those crucial early days, or putting all the early year care on mother, who would be utterly exhausted, is reckless and assumptive. And I kind of tend to agree with them, actually, I have to say. So as you can see, so this is taken from another bit of the dad survey where we were asking about why or this kind of this conflict that dads tend to find themselves in. And it was really interesting. I was looking today at whether there's any information on this dads feeling differently to mums about their responsibility to provide for their children. And I found a report by Business in the Community called Equal Lives Parented and Caring in the Workplace. It's from 2018, so things might have changed a little bit. But it was a report from around about 10,000 employees, both men and women. And it found that 31% of men and 9% of women feel that it's a man's main role to provide money and resources for his family. So a third of men really feel their identity or their role within the family is to provide for their families. So you can see how that internal conflict would kind of play out actually in terms of being there for their family, being present for their family, and feeling this real need to provide for their family as well. So, and having to make difficult choices around that. So as these dads were saying, sometimes it's hard to pick my work over my children, but I have to prioritize work over my family so I can provide for them. And other conflicting demands, conflicting work and home commitments make it difficult to focus or appreciate either. And these, obviously, because they're conflicted, they're obviously coupled with feelings of guilt and regret. So it's tricky balance to strike, and I rarely feel I get it right. Either I feel guilty about working, or I feel guilty about spending time with family. So coming back to this notion of paternity leave, or that support around mums and dads after the birth of a child. What was really interesting is that when we looked at how difficult dads found balancing work and family life, actually it was dads who have children between 1 and 2 who are finding it the most difficult. So 45% of dads with children between 1 and 2 found balancing family life difficult or very difficult compared to an average of just 26 at other times. And my feeling is, it's just a working hypothesis, really, but I suspect that where mums are having maternity leave with their children so they maybe have 9 months maternity leave in the first year, it makes it easier, even if dad doesn't have paternity leave or very little paternity leave, it might make it easier for the dad um, to to balance their work and family life. But once the mum maybe has gone back to work, it then becomes much more difficult to manage that kind of work-life balance. So this is one of the dads with children in that age group. My working hours means I'm unable to take my son to many group activities, etc., which are available during work weekdays. There are some of the weekends, which I take advantage of when I can, summon up enough energy at the end of the working week. I try to finish work early some days to give us more time together. I then need to make up the hours at other times, which can be difficult to fit in. I'll try and just get through the rest of these slides fairly quickly so we can have a little chat about it. But dads also wanted access to low-cost activities for children and better inclusion of dads within services, particularly during the early years. So I love this quote. So this is dad who talks about how welcome he feels in a play group. So being more welcome at play groups, etc. It's so often a women-dominated sphere, and it's hard not to feel as welcome as you can fill in the in the blanks in a pool. So almost half. So again, this is another key finding from our dad survey. It's almost, I think, possibly the most important finding from our dad survey this year, which showed that almost half, so 49% of dads with dependent children, so that's under 18, were spending more than 25 hours per week playing or supporting their children's learning. That's up from this is the highest level that we've ever recorded. So, so even during the lockdowns, dads are doing more now than they ever have done in the past. And as this dad rightly points out, my generation is different from my dad's and my grandparents. We're much more involved and often do the mainstay, but perception in society is that we don't, and it needs to be more accurate to life. So as I said, this is absolutely the highest level that we've ever recorded. And we had 1,000 dads surveyed. The eagle-eyed amongst you will see that this number is only 45%, but actually in this dad survey, we had 14% of all the dads who were surveyed had children 18 or above. And in our 22 dad survey, that was only 4%. So you can see actually once you kind of reduce that gap, you'll see that actually this number is actually even higher. So again, it's dads with children under 2 who are doing the most, as you can see. So 63% of dads with children under 1, and 62% of dads with children under or between 1 and 2, spending the most time doing that work. And again, this number is going up. So compared between our dad survey in 2022, which showed 8 in 10 dads spending over 10 hours per day with their children, that's gone up to 9 in 10 dads. So actually the levels of father involvement is going up. And the same with dads from the most deprived areas, actually. So dads from SIMD1, which are the most deprived areas in Scotland, 64% of them are doing more than 25 hours a week of playing with their children or supporting their learning. And that's compared to just 35% of dads from SIMD5. So the most sort of affluent areas of Scotland. And again, these numbers are increasing. So the numbers that we're finding this year are 17% higher than in 2022. So the change is happening really rapidly, is what I'm saying. Interestingly enough, though, dads don't feel as though they are spending enough quality time with their dads, so they're not satisfied with the amount of quality time they're spending with their children, which is quite interesting. So hopefully this year when we do our dad survey, we're going to look in a bit more detail into that. Dads also want to feel valued and supported by healthcare services, especially when it comes to mental health. So as Dad said, if there could be more acceptance of dads throughout the birthing process rather than just being in the background, even at home visits. I understand that mum is a focus and she needs to recover, but dads can take a lot of stress as well. And obviously that's a lot of work that Scott does and we do as an organisation to try and improve that. Dads want to be told about the information and support available and better ways to connect with other dads, particularly in the early years. So more information before, during, and after having kids. I found some of it a minefield. I feel there's more opportunities for dads to meet other dads and socialize in group settings that would help struggling dads greatly. I'm sure that Errol will have something to say about that. I think that's actually true, though. And finally, I think this is really interesting. Dads want to be seen as the equal parent and for dads to be included and acknowledged right from the beginning. So this notion that dads want greater equality and acknowledgement for their role as a caregiver. As this dad said, we seem to be an afterthought in everything concerning children and family and equal rights throughout separation. I have a close friend who lost everything they had just to get access to their children.